Hey everyone, welcome to the 5th webinar in our series. This one was a big boy, so we have cut it into two sections. The first section is just going to be on dosing in CBD, while the second section is going to be on CBD and interactions with medications and interactions in general with the body. So I tried to put them all together and it started to become a 50-slide sort of brigade. So here we go on just the dosing part. So what we're going to touch on part one is, what is the right dose? Kind of a complicated question, but hopefully by the end of this I can convince you that there's four really important parts to that question. The second is just going to, again, we almost do this every week, but we're going to talk about how isolate dosing and full spectrum dosing is different. And then we're going to comb over the literature and take a look at some recent studies that have popped up in there and take a look at the clinical studies and what they're looking for when it comes to milligrams. And then finally, I'm going to briefly touch on this, but I hope that this is probably the reason that most of you are here, is to figure out specific ailments and specific dosing numbers associated with that. And again, as you'll see when I get there, it's going to be more complicated than this is the exact dosing, this is the exact number, okay? So I'm going to try and give you a broader understanding of how to answer that question and kind of point you to some actual numbers associated with that. Like I said, part two is going to happen next week. It's going to be more of a overlook at how competing drugs work, what are CYP receptors, and what are some specific medications that are going to interact with CBD. And then finally, next week we're going to talk about what to say to customers when they're asking about all of these different kind of questions. So today it's just going to be on dosing. So again, looking at our definitions, we did this last week. I'm going to just do it again. An isolate is 99% CBD with no other compounds. This is the one that we avoid in general. It is in some of our products, but that's just because that's the only way you can make food products and some of the pet products that we sell. Full spectrum, that contains the entire plant and has trace amounts of THC. Broad spectrum contains the entire plant. However, we strip out the THC. And then water soluble, that means that it can be absorbed by water, which then means that it's more like our blood, which then creates an increased bioavailability and increases the effective dose that the CBD will reach the body. So these are just the broad definitions that we do almost every week. So the question of what is the right dose? That is a question that is pretty much the most important question that any owner will get. So here's the four sort of things that I think about when I'm talking about what is the right dose. You want to make sure that the dose is going to be reproducible. So at some point, there's going to be this fluctuation, and we'll talk about the specifics after this. And we want to make sure that fluctuation in how they're receiving the dose is minimized so that we can start to track whether the dose is effective or not. We want to target specific ailments. So that means that if a dose is a low dose phenomenon or a high dose phenomenon where it impacts an ailment, we want to make sure that we're targeting that specifically. We want to be cost effective as well. So that means that we're not overdosing an ailment that doesn't require that, because then we're having a negative experience from the customer standpoint, and they're not actually utilizing the amount of milligrams per dollar that they should be of CBD. And then finally, what is the right dose? We want to make sure that it's not interacting negatively with any other medications, because what that can do is modulate a lot of things, and we want to just limit this part. So if we can have an understanding of all four of these elements, then we, in theory, have the best dose for the customer on whatever they're targeting. So reproducible, how do we make that happen? So one debate that is now not a debate is whether or not to take CBD on a full stomach or not. The theory around this was, okay, if we have an empty stomach, that means our body's going to uptake the CBD fully, and it's not going to be competing with foods. What it turns out is that we actually want the CBD to be competing with omega fatty acids, triglycerides, and other oil-based foods, so that it actually stays around and travels to different parts of the body before it gets clipped by our liver. So what we don't want to happen is have that CBD quickly get absorbed by the liver, so that it then becomes a dead end molecule. So what we want to recommend to people for a more reproducible experience with CBD is to have a full stomach and make sure that you're doing some sort of oil-based food like fish, certain types of nuts, and that's also why triglyceride chains are important. MCT is a very large carrier oil that has triglycerides throughout. So coconut oil is a great food. That's why we want to try and include that. Other carrier oils are also follow the same trend, but that's just an example. So the other part of the reproducible equation is take it at the same time and take the same amount and make sure that we're staggering this 2 to 4 times a day. So the time and the place, we want to reproduce that as much as we can. Having it multiple times a day will then keep your levels of CBD at a constant, and then it'll basically allow your body to understand, okay, I'm in homeostasis right now. When is my next uptake of CBD going to happen? Okay, I have it at this time. And if that is sort of like a clock, your body will respond in a much more consistent way rather than, okay, I didn't take my dose, now I'm going to take a lot. And what I understand the propensity for this to happen because life happens and people can't do this, but ideally this is again what we're trying to talk about when we're dealing with profound effects, when we're dealing with mood modulations. These are super important to follow, these sort of reproducibility questions. And then finally what we want to do is try your best to take the same sort of product. So if you're taking a broad spectrum, you want to make sure that you're taking a broad spectrum consistently. If you do supplement with an isolate or something like that, again, just go back to the other steps and make sure that you're regularly doing this. So if you're going to vape 1 or 2 times a day, make sure that you're trying to do that at the same sort of time. And your body is really a clock in this way, especially when we're talking about the endocannabinoid system, because it is regulating a huge portion of our bodily functions. If we're not having the same sort of conditions, and that means adding certain types of CBD, if those conditions aren't the same, then you're going to have sort of a disproportionate effect that will happen in your body. So if you just took a crap ton of isolate one day, and then the next day you vape a broad spectrum, then what you're going to have is a profoundly different experience with CBD. Whether that's a good experience or not, you have to try to monitor these things. So these are sort of the things that you need to make sure that our customers are aware of from a dosing level. And this will just change overnight what their experience is with CBD and how to track their dose and try to make it the right dose. So the next question is, are we targeting the right ailment? So not all ailments utilize CBD in the same way. Some of them require higher or lower doses, and I will go over that specifics near the end of this webinar. But like I just said, the delivery methods can impact ailments differently. So for example, our water-soluble product will impact you quicker. Let's say I have a headache and I just need something to help, with that inflammatory part of the headache and reduce the pain and, have that instantaneous absorption. That's going to be a different type of ailment targeting. But if I want to then go with our tincture, then that could help something like a persistent pain in your knee, where the headache is more like a flare-up, if you will. And a persistent problem will benefit from a consistent dosage of the tincture, where the tincture is going to sit in your body, be absorbed over a couple hours, and last up to maybe 8 hours, while the water-soluble will be almost a 6-minute, 8-minute trigger is what the numbers are looking like now in the research, and sometimes lasts up to 2.5 hours. So again, how you target an ailment, you need to understand what kind of product you're using and what is the implementation of that product, as that's a very important component to this. Cost effective. So obviously what we want to do from a lot of standpoints, but from a customer standpoint, we want to make sure that they're not overusing CBD. They're also not underusing CBD if they need to go up to that, because that's also a waste of product. So what you want is the perfect dose, but we also want to create zero waste of CBD that's being utilized by our customers. So in some situations, a delivery method could be the reason that they're not getting their ailment targeted, and they need to just switch to a water soluble. They need to switch to a vape. They need to switch to a tincture. Whatever is working for them, though, they also need to hone in on that and figure out consistently why that product is working. So having customers constantly switching in and out of a water soluble and a tincture, we wouldn't recommend that, as it's not a reproducible effect. But again, if something is not working for a customer, there's a lot of different solutions that we can provide. We can up their dose, we can lower their dose. We can get them on vaping twice a day while they're doing a water soluble in the middle of the day. So these are sort of things that we can look at and try and get this cost-effective number for the customer at the perfect value for how much they're putting in to the product. And again, there's only, this is just from a green perspective, but there's only so much CBD in the world. We don't want to be just, throwing it away to underdosing or overdosing somebody's ailment. So then the final kind of key to what is the right dose is what are the interactions with other medications. And this is important for twofold. We don't want CBD negatively impacting a medication, but we also don't want it to positively be interacting with a medication. And if that is the case, we want to be able to track that and make sure that we are acknowledging this with the patient's doctor and tracking what's happening with the medication as well as what's happening with the CBD, that whatever ailment you're targeting. So just over the overview of everything, medication is almost always going to be altered whenever there's a new behavior in the body. So chemicals and drugs constantly compete for signaling and then create functionality in the body. So that means things like stress, your diet, different hormonal changes, a traumatic event, lack of sleep, and then also just like plant medicine in general, are just a few examples of things that can greatly interact with a medication. All of those things are true. Your diet is probably one of the most impactful things. They've seen a lot of new studies on people that are in ketosis having completely adverse effects with their medications. And the reason is when you're in ketosis, your body, it lacks carbs, it starts to utilize proteins in different ways, and it kind of just changes your chemical behavior. That's why when you see a lot of profound mood changes sometimes when people go into different diets or different crashes of, that sort of modulation can actually impact your global bodily economy for what's competing for what. And medications are basically supposed to be designed by pharmacists to target a specific pathway. And if you start to just mess with that pathway in the slightest bit, then we're going to start to see some different interactions. And what that all leads to is CBD will interact with many prescriptions, but to what degree? And from most of the things that we've looked at, we actually got some great answers to this question, and most of them are very small changes. But what is great is because CBD is acting in this homeostasis where it's regulating our endocannabinoid system, the body starts to figure this out, and after a couple weeks you can see a very reproducible interaction with medications in where you could then predict how to raise or lower your medication to target, the differences that are happening while you're on CBD. So if somebody is on CBD already and they add a medication, that's going to be very easy for the doctor, the physician, to track what is the right level for that medication. If somebody's on a medication before and then they add CBD to their regimen, that's going to be probably a couple weeks before everything starts to balance out. And there's a lot of new studies on this with human trials that have been very compelling from this, specifically with Xanax, and looking at what does the body, like what are the half-life events there, how long is the CBD staying in your system, how much of the Xanax is being consumed, and they found that after 2 weeks it all starts to balance out into a very nice regular pattern. So before that, they were seeing some variance in that, but at about 2 weeks, your body is just naturally understands the signals that are coming in from the CBD and from the medication. So again, let's go into the isolate discussion versus full spectrum. So kind of, I guess, the challenge for dosing and understanding this stuff at this point is almost every single human trial that's been done is under a isolate form. And the problem with that is, from our perspective, is that is one compound going in and modulating and could potentially interact with medication. That does not include what we are selling, which is a broad spectrum product or full spectrum product that has a number of different compounds in it. So we are also different in the way that isolates are going to go in and have a certain milligram associated with it. The effective milligram for it to be in a full spectrum compound, that question is still unanswered. So from that example, what I'm saying is, if there's 100 milligrams of an isolate, does that mean that's effectively what a 20 milligram dosage of a full spectrum is? There's not a bunch of research on that yet. There's a couple papers that show that the entourage effect is real, and you need profoundly less amount of CBD that's in a full spectrum to do the equivalencies of an isolate, but there's no number that is working on each specific ailment that's being targeted. So in someday, hopefully, there'll be enough research where each ailment will have an isolate dosing recommendation, and then each form will also have each ailment will also have a full spectrum dosage. And maybe there will be some sort of a factor that, across the board, it's about 5 to 6 times more impactful, the full spectrum. But my guess is that each ailment will actually have a small modulator there. So arthritis will be, it'll be a higher dosage of full spectrum effectively than isolate, where if it's something like a cancer or some sort of epilepsy, maybe the isolate does most of the work and then the entourage effect is lower. But we're talking about a lot of molecules at once, so this question of full spectrum being this one-to-one translation to the literature research, it's kind of like a yeah-but situation at this point. So again, the full spectrum has these cannabinoids, plant materials, and terpenes, so these are what we talk about as an active compound because these are all doing work in our system, where before the isolate is just doing a one compound dosage, so it's much easier to track the interactions with that. So a lot of work to be done in this space, but let's look at some of the numbers here in the literature. So some takeaways, just some broad takeaways of what the literature is looking at from a dosing perspective. And when I'm talking about this, I'm talking about the research in mice and in human trials and all FDA trials. And what we see is the dosing numbers are very high. We see, and we'll look at the specifics soon, but just be aware that these are going to be high. There's a couple reasons for that. Whenever you're doing a trial, you're trying to push the outer limits of efficacy, and you're trying to probe for side effects. So whenever you're doing a human trial on any sort of compound, any sort of pharmaceutical compound, you do not want to do it right at the dose that you think is perfect. You want to do it at the upper limit, and you want to do it at the lower limit. And you want to see the effects at both of those. So just be aware that that's what's happening in these studies, and not to take this as trends. There's probably going to be some company out there that's going to say, we need 500 milligrams for pain, and everyone doesn't, none of this CBD is doing anything. The problem with that is that they're looking at an isolate form. They're probably looking at a capsule form, which I'll talk about in a second. So the effective amount of CBD that's being utilized is probably much, much lower when you're talking about a full spectrum or a broad spectrum product like we're selling. So the other thing that's important to look at is all of these numbers are listed as milligram per kilogram body weight. And that's something that we're trying to work on to figure out and wrap our heads around how to create a consistent dosing using this model. And probably there's going to be some sort of chart that we include at some point with our recommendation for specific ailments that use this number. And again, it'll be milligram per pound because we don't use the metric system, unfortunately. And this will be something that people can use as a starting point to figure out their dosing. But again, that's how they list it. And like I said, these are done with isolates. But the other important thing to note is that some of these are done with synthetic isolates, which mean that they're not a perfect, as much as synthetic CBD you would think would be purer than an isolate form. it turns out the plant is just better at creating CBD, and when you do a chemical extraction of it, you can actually clean it slightly better than when you're doing a synthetic creation of the compound, because chemical reactions have X amount of side effects that happen during the reaction, where you have a small byproduct when you do create it. So I've seen some studies that were done on 97% pure CBD isolate, which means that there's a higher chance of side effects, which we then don't even see with that unpure product. So even though it's a gross sort of form of CBD, a synthetic form, it actually is something that to take away in a positive for us, that there is still no side effects and toxicity reported with this. So again, there are no side effects that we've seen, up to 1,500 mgs a day. And then the addiction and other questions are starting to be asked and answered, whether it's addictive or not, and all of the signs are pointing towards it not being addictive. THC, that debate is still to be had, whether that's addicting or not. The community's pretty split on that, but the World Health Organization, the FDA, and other reputable scientific communities have all agreed CBD does not display this sort of psychosis, addictive sort of question. And the methodologies of the dosages are still, at the end of these studies, they still are not sure about, what does this mean in the end of, at the end? What is their perspective? What they're doing is just reporting the dosage, looking at the side effects, and they still haven't quite landed on this is the optimal dosing. Like what we said before, what's the right dose? Nobody has actually came out with a paper that says this is what we want to do for nausea. This is what we want to do for rheumatoid arthritis. These are questions that we have to work on as a community, and honestly, we're at the ground floor with our customers, getting feedback with them, figuring out high dose, low dose. You guys probably know better than anybody what your customers take and what works for them, and that's the end of the day what we're looking for. So let's look. We're gonna do 3 quick papers here of dosing numbers that have been reported, that are FDA studies, that are recent studies, that are all very compelling stuff to look at. So Epidiolex, this is the FDA approved drug. It comes in a 100 milliliter bottle, and they dose it out as 100 milligrams per milliliter. It is a spray, so it's an oral solution is what they call it. It coats the back of your throat with the dosage, and they give you a syringe that is a 1 milliliter syringe, and they recommend a dosage at the end, at the bottom there, 0.5 to 5 mils, which is 50 to 500 milligrams. Again, this is an isolate. This is an effective way of dosing because it's almost like the subdermal thing. However, it's coating the back of your throat as a spray. So there's some sort of questions as if this is the best way or if subdermally it would be better. We're not sure at this point, but subdermally is obviously the most practical way right now. But if we find out that this is definitely a more absorbing property using a spray, we'll definitely shift to this sort of idea. But the way that they did this is 5 milligrams per kilogram of body weight. 50 milligrams per kilogram body weight was the upper limit that they did in the study. Now, again, that's different than what their product is that they're selling right now, which is down at the bottom. That's the milligram dosage. But let's look in the study. So what I did is I took this table. That's the average age of a male child from 2 to 12, just kind of random. Obviously, this isn't the range of children that were in the study. They didn't release that information. But if we look at that, we have a 27.5 to an 88-pound child. If we convert that to kilograms, what we're looking at, if you did the 5 milligram per kilogram lower range here at the top of the screen, what that is somewhere between 62 milligrams up to 200 milligrams daily for a child. And that would be an average 2-year-old child. If you went on the high range, that's a 2-year-old to a 12-year-old child. Those are the two ranges. If you went on the high range, the 2-year-old child would effectively take 620 milligrams, and then the 12-year-old child would take almost 2,000 milligrams daily. So these are the numbers that they worked with the study. The takeaways that I have for that is, wow, those are extremely high. And wow, those don't have any side effects. Because that is the number one thing they were doing with this study. That's why it's an FDA-approved study. That's why it's an FDA-approved product, is they probe for side effects. They went through all of the liver toxicities. They looked through ocular, blurry vision, that sort of thing. No side effects were there. And to me, that's compelling because it's a child. So there's a lot of parameters that happen with a developing child. A lot of, systems that are high variance when it comes to side effects. You see a lot of prescriptions that say, do not give to children, because what you can do with a child is mess with something that isn't a fully formed system yet. There might be a protein that expresses some sort of, part of your body that's yet to grow, that once you modulate that, then you get growth defects, then you get brain damage, then you get really horrible cancers, lung disease. Things that you wouldn't see as a side effect in an adult doesn't mean that you're clear for a child. So the fact that this study was done on children is a great look into what we think CBD works as, which is a homeostasis endocannabinoid regulator, rather than a single molecule targeting system where you're cleaving a protein here, an enzyme here, and trying to fix the body that way. This is really an inside-out approach, which means that you should limit all the side effects, and it looks like from this FDA-regulated study that there were absolutely no side effects associated. So very good news in that regard. What does that mean for our products? This means that we can safely dose at a pretty reasonable clip up to, because this is what they sell right here, 500 milligrams of isolate. So that is a number that I would feel very confident in giving to an adult, giving to a child even at that point. Obviously, we want to make sure we're working very closely with a doctor for giving an isolate to a child. But in some of these cases, this is curing an incurable seizure by just using that milligrams. So the second study we wanted to look at, it was a fairly recent one, but this one is a Xanax study with a THC pill and a CBD pill. The way that this study broke down is they gave them, and a sugar pill. They basically gave them 4 of these pills at once and just started to watch what were the side effects associated to them. The long and the short of this was these were capsules. And what they did was they gave them 500 milligrams and 1,000 milligrams. And if you look to the right here, the dose comes in at that 1,500, and this is a very conservative estimation of how first pass numbers get calculated. But let's just say at the end here, that 15% at the very top, that's what comes out. If you do 15% of 500 and 1,000, and trust me, the numbers on the CBDs cutting in the liver puts that number down to 4% sometimes. But if we're going to say 15% of it makes it into the bloodstream, we're looking at 75 to 150 milligrams of non-water-soluble CBD isolate entering the bloodstream. So even though these are high dosages, what we want to think about is that's about 75, 150 of a pure isolate. Our capsules are going to kind of break the math all over the place here. They're going to be water-soluble. They're going to be broad-spectrum, which means they have an entourage effect. And the water solubility alone is going to increase it by 4 times the bioavailability. And if we create a capsule that's 25 milligrams, if you just multiply it by 4 and then don't even talk about what the entourage effect is for effective dosing, we're up to 100 milligrams of broad spectrum entourage effect, heavy CBD that enters the bloodstream. So these are why people may look at the numbers here and say, oh, why is my capsule not 1,000 milligrams? Well, it's because, first off, we're designing it so it's bioavailable, and we're creating it with a broad spectrum entourage effect. So we're going to get a huge impact from a dosing level that an isolate just can't perform at. So I just wanted to show you here the very conservative number of 15% of that 1,000 milligram. If it were to be dosed in that ideal case perfectly, then you could get 150, and that's kind of where we're tuning our dosing numbers for a capsule and for any sort of tincture-based argument of what's a proper dose. So this study came out yesterday. It's from August, but just finished publication yesterday. And this made science news for, I think the headline was no pain without the high, that sort of, health without the high, or Basically, they're trying to steal every CBD company's slogan with this science headline. This made national news in a lot of situations. They claimed that they found the dosage that was zero THC product, isolate again, and they said this has no side effects, and the cumulative effects of this have shown that it doesn't have any adverse effects in the body over an amount of time, and it still targets a large amount of pain. So you don't actually need THC to target pain, and these are the numbers that we say the CBD can work at, and you still have the same anti-pain effects. The problem with this study is it's kind of reinventing the wheel, and it's kind of already doing things that everyone's talked about. And even in the study, it says CBD in therapeutics is used with a large therapeutic window ranging from 2.85 to 50 milligrams per kilogram per day, meaning that its therapeutic dose is still unclear. So this is the window that they're looking at, right? Almost 3 milligrams per kilogram body weight up to 50. And this is sort of the first shot at this. But what's encouraging about this study, and this again was a rodent study, is that they are now starting to understand that the THC component isn't the only thing that's needed to target pain and anti-inflammation. So with that going forward, that might kind of change the direction that the entire industry goes. And as you know, we'll talk about legal ramifications and all that stuff going forward. If they don't want any THC in our products going forward, we have good precedent as to saying, okay, well, we can still target a number of issues that are going on. Maybe we will miss on some of the mood modulations, as those have been shown to have THC pathways, but it looks like the pain and anti-inflammation could just be, as long as you have enough of the CBD, could still just be a way to deal with that problem without introducing THC to the products. So that brings us to our final two slides. And again, I went fast over these. I have all of these papers available. If you want to look at Epidiolex, just type in Epidiolex FDA studies. And this was on clinicaltrials.gov. If you type in there, you'll see a number of different trials that are ongoing and that have already been completed. And it is very difficult to navigate those pages. But if you give it a shot, you might be able to pull some bits of data with it. And if you are very interested in something, let me know. I can go over that study myself and give you a sort of brief report of what I think. Because they're doing studies every single day, especially in Canada, that are targeting Alzheimer's, that are targeting specific ailments, and they're all done with CBD. And it's very exciting to wait on these things that happen, but you can see them ongoing, and you can start to take a look at what's in the pipeline for these clinical trials. So, that being said, our final two slides are on ailment-specific dosing. So, the answer to this is there is no perfect answer. Depends on all of the factors that we discussed earlier about what is a perfect dose. But let's just do some assumptions real quick, and then I will give you some numbers that, again, these are not exact numbers, but these are tiers of sort of how I have interpreted the research as to what people are finding works in low dose settings and high dose settings, and what are the huge high tiered problems that need a lot of milligrams to impact the body. And again, these milligrams, I'm not sure how much the entourage effect is changing and how much bioavailability is changing these numbers, but let's just call this an effective isolate dosing. Okay, so the numbers that we looked at before, right? This 150, that's probably an effective isolate dosing, even though it was 1,000 milligrams that entered the body. So, let's make three assumptions. Let's assume that the body weight and the metabolism is static across the board. So this is some robotic human that is, 150 pounds and has a very standard metabolism. Let's also assume that the same source of CBD creates this effective dose. So that means if you're vaping, if you're eating it, if you're taking an isolate orally, if you're using a tincture, let's just assume that this is an effective milligram of CBD. And then again, we're looking at the same type of stomach conditions, the same type of food has entered the body, the exact same time has happened that you're dosing this. So in an ideal case, let's look at these. So what I've set up is this low tier, medium tier, and high tier. The low tier would be problems that have been shown to be solved with lower dosing. Middle tiered is like that. So 20 milligrams to 100 I deemed as middle tiered. Again, these numbers are just my understanding. They can be drastically different, but just for argument's sake, if we had these into these 3 tiers, these are what I've identified as ailment-specific dosing. You can see the highlight here. What I would do, and Adam and I are going to try and work on this next week to produce these tables in a digestive way that have all the caveats that I want. And I didn't want to just roll this out and dump this without any information. I want you guys to interact with this. Let me know what I found this study on kidney disease that was actually showing a low dose dependency. So each one of these I've highlighted in the colors that I've described here as being a low tiered, middle tiered, or high tiered problem or ailment. And again, this does not mean that it cures Parkinson's disease. That means that the study that I've seen here used a very high dose when it was trying to impact Parkinson's disease, and it was shown to be effective at a high dose. The same thing for ALS. Cancer stuff that we've seen doesn't mean that it cures cancer, but that means that the dose that they're trying to impact cancer with is much higher than something that's trying to impact anxiety, which is a low dose dependency, inflammation, nausea. So what I would do is either pause the screen or whatever and take a look at this. And again, we'll be producing content around this slide probably specifically for probably a couple weeks or something to try and work on these things to get these in a digestible form so that you guys can have a cheat sheet with you when you're talking to somebody and you give them all the caveats that we talked about and you just tell them, okay, this is going to be a low dose problem, a middle dose problem, a high dose problem. And these are all going to change. I mean, these are gradients too. I'm putting them in 3 different categories. It does not mean that they're exactly the same or they operate the same way. But I think this is probably going to be the most important slide that we deal with for a long time. So, again, take a look. It's a lot of information, obviously. But I've tried to, and I already see that the pain general and pain severe, that should be a middle green on the severe, not a light green. But that will change for sure. So next webinar, we went through the dosing questions, but I didn't get time and I didn't feel comfortable just going into the drug interactions because it is a whole nother ball game of looking at specific drugs and why it's interacting and what are the impacts of that. I have a very large manifesto that I've been pulling from lately that describes this, and it's very, very detail-oriented. I can give some, again, what my hope is to create something like this at the end of that slide that goes over these different compounds and different pharmaceuticals that we know are competing with our CBD. So until then, I hope you guys have a great weekend, and whenever you watch this, if it's in the future, I hope you enjoyed this next webinar.